May 26, 1941, Lake Pontchartrain, New Orleans, Louisiana. Commander Ross Daggett of the Navy Bureau of Ships stood at the water's edge, arms tightly folded across his chest, observing a curious plywood vessel repeatedly smashing into the concrete seawall. With each collision, the hull shuddered, then spun nearly within its own length before charging the wall again. Behind him, Major Ernest Linsert of the Marine Corps Equipment Board furiously jotted notes, his pen racing across the page. They had come to witness what the Navy leadership in Washington had dismissed as the dream of a brash Irishman with more confidence than sense. What they were about to witness would alter the course of the Second World War. The man orchestrating this controlled chaos was Andrew Jackson Higgins, demonstrating a craft with a revolutionary feature that Navy engineers had spent 2 decades trying, and failing, to achieve. A simple steel ramp at the bow that could drop down, allowing troops and vehicles to rush directly onto a beach. Within 4 years, this plywood innovation would carry more Allied soldiers to hostile shores than all other landing methods combined. Without it, Dwight Eisenhower would later note in 1964, the Allied strategy for victory would have been unachievable. The story of this moment began not with triumph, but with adversity. In 1931, Higgins's lumber export firm had entered voluntary receivership during the Great Depression. The Nebraskan entrepreneur had built a fleet of sailing vessels to transport hardwood from the Philippines and Central America, establishing his own shipyard to maintain them. When global trade collapsed, both A.J. Higgins Lumber and Export Company and Higgins Industries were placed under receivership, with Higgins himself appointed to manage the process. Faced with a boatyard, mounting debts, and an unyielding resolve, Higgins refused to give up. He had gained knowledge of boat design during a brief stint in the Nebraska National Guard and refined it through necessity in the bayous of Louisiana. The shallow marshes and debris-choked waterways of the Gulf Coast required craft that could operate in as little as 18 inches of water, push through vegetation, glide over submerged logs, and beach safely without fouling the propellers. Conventional boats failed miserably. Higgins created something different. His Eureka boat, first developed in 1926 and refined throughout the 1930s, included innovations that were deceptively simple yet remarkably effective. The spoon-shaped bow allowed it to ride over obstacles rather than plowing through them, reinforced by a solid pine block called the head log, capable of absorbing tremendous impacts. The hull was revolutionary, a deep V at the front, transitioning into a reverse curve amidships, and flattening into planing surfaces at the rear, creating an aerated flow that reduced drag and increased speed. Most importantly, a semi-tunnel within the hull protected the propeller and drive shaft, allowing the boat to charge a beach at full speed and reverse off safely. Oil drillers, trappers, and even Prohibition-era bootleggers relied on these boats for their unique capabilities. Higgins maintained his operation during the Depression by constructing them one at a time. By 1931, he had founded Boat Services Company, purchasing craft from Higgins Industries to lease or sell to others, keeping roughly 50 people employed. By 1935, he had cleared his debts and stayed solvent while countless others went under. Halfway across the globe, events were shaping the world and bringing the U.S. military to Higgins's doorstep. In 1937, Japanese forces invaded China, and American observers took note. Lieutenant Victor Kruak of the Marine Corps, perched on a Shanghai rooftop, captured the landing operations using a telephoto-equipped camera. The Japanese Daihatsu-class craft employed a simple but ingenious feature, a bow ramp that allowed troops and equipment to rush directly onto the shore. Kruak sent photographs and a detailed report titled Japanese Assault Boats, Shanghai, 1937, back to Washington, where it was dismissed as the work of a crank. In the late 1930s, the U.S. military remained ill-prepared for amphibious warfare, despite the Marine Corps increasingly emphasizing its necessity. The Navy's Bureau of Construction and Repair had attempted landing craft designs, but Higgins later deemed them worthless. By the time he learned about the Navy's failed trials in 1938, he was not even invited to participate. Frustrated, Marine officers recalled the Eureka boats used by the Coast Guard and reached out directly to Higgins. bypassing Navy bureaucracy. Higgins brought his Eureka craft to Norfolk, Virginia for testing, where it outperformed every Navy design, beaching at full speed, reversing cleanly, turning sharply, and maintaining speed in shallow waters. Fleet exercises in February 1939 confirmed its superiority. Yet Washington remained skeptical. The Navy had invested years and political capital in its own designs, and Higgins, with his brash manner and salty language, was not part of their elite circle. Legend has it that Higgins visited the Bureau of Ships, examined their blueprints, and remarked bluntly, "This boat stinks." Officers were not amused, but after repeated failures in Navy designs and consistent success in Higgins' craft, there was no alternative. In 1939, the Navy reluctantly commissioned Higgins to produce landing craft personnel, LCP. However, these boats still required soldiers to clamber over the sides, a dangerous process under fire. By April 1941, WWII had built a balsa wood model of the Japanese design featuring a retractable bow ramp. Higgins inspected it for a mere 30 seconds, immediately grasping its potential. He called his chief engineer, and within hours, work on prototypes had begun. Without waiting for contracts or approval, Higgins modified the Eureka design, creating a steel-reinforced ramp that could lower for troops or jeeps and raise to form the protective bow. By late May 1941, the prototypes were ready for testing. WWII would go on to an illustrious career, advancing to lieutenant general and becoming one of the most influential strategists in Marine Corps history. He championed helicopter assault techniques that would later define amphibious operations in the jet era and authored First to Fight, an insider's account of the Marine Corps that became a classic in military literature. He maintained throughout his life that the Higgins boat represented the single most significant tactical innovation of World War II. WWII passed away in 2008 at the age of 95, having witnessed the boats he helped inspire participate in operations from Guadalcanal to the invasions of Iraq. On that decisive day, May 26, 1941, Commander Daggett and Major Linsert arrived at Lake Pontchartrain to observe demonstrations that would either validate or discredit months of Higgins' efforts. Higgins showcased his boats with trademark flair. He loaded 36 of his workers into a single craft, simulating a fully equipped combat platoon. The boat surged across the lake at 12 knots, ran directly onto the shore, the bow rising slightly, then dropped its ramp with a metallic clang and disgorged all 36 men in seconds. The soldiers charged down the ramp and onto the beach as the engine idled. The ramp then raised, the boat reversed smoothly, spun tightly, and repeated the maneuver. Higgins followed by driving a truck onto the craft, proving its capacity to transport vehicles. The boat approached the shore once more, beached, lowered the ramp, and Higgins drove the truck directly onto land without hesitation. The military observers were astonished. This was precisely what the Marine Corps required for amphibious assaults. The Navy Bureau of Ships, however, remained antagonistic toward the outsider who had repeatedly outperformed them. They had spent 2 decades attempting to develop a tank landing craft and had failed entirely. When Higgins constructed a functioning tank landing craft in just 61 hours as a demonstration, the Bureau resented him for exposing their inefficiency. The Marine Corps, however, was resolute. They needed these boats in large numbers immediately. As tensions with Japan escalated in late 1941, the Navy finally placed substantial orders for what became the landing craft, Vehicle Personnel, LCVP. The Higgins boat, as it would be universally known to the troops who rode in it, was officially born. Historians later noted that the LCVP designation specifically referred to the ramped version, differentiating it from earlier LCP models without ramps. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Higgins Industries employed fewer than 75 workers in a single yard. The company's net sales in 1937 had been $422,000. Andrew Higgins immediately recognized the implications of the attack for his business and for America. He began expanding preemptively, opening new facilities and hiring at a pace that astounded observers, defying conventional business practices. He acquired land near City Park along the Industrial Canal and at Michoud in eastern New Orleans, setting up production lines using assembly techniques adapted from automobile manufacturing, a revolutionary approach to boat construction. Traditionally, boats were crafted individually by skilled artisans. Higgins transformed production into an assembly line system, with workers specializing in specific tasks. He hired anyone capable of working: white men, black men, women, elderly laborers, and people with disabilities, an unprecedented approach in New Orleans and throughout the South. Higgins Industries became the city's first fully integrated workforce, breaking decades of racial barriers. All employees received equal pay according to their job, regardless of race or gender. Black and white workers labored side by side. Women operated machinery typically reserved for men, and everyone contributed to unprecedented production rates. Higgins addressed critics bluntly, asserting that his priority was skilled labor, not color or gender. Workers responded with loyalty and remarkable output. Loudspeakers throughout the plants allowed Higgins to address the workforce simultaneously, and during urgent orders he appeared on the factory floor personally, delivering profanity-laced pep talks that inspired rather than offended. Motivational signs reminded workers that every boat carried American soldiers into combat, and a single defect could cost lives. The workers called him Andy with a mix of respect and affection. When he awarded a 12% pay increase in August 1942, he strongly suggested investing it in war bonds, and the workforce complied, subscribing 15% of payroll without complaint. By late 1943, Higgins Industries operated 7 production facilities across New Orleans, with the workforce swelling from fewer than 75 in 1938 to over 25,000 by 1943. Some sources cite 20,000, depending on counting methods. Net sales had risen from $422,000 in 1937 to over $10 million in 1941, and $144 million in 1944. Contracts with the U.S. government totaled $350 million. This expansion, from 75 workers to over 20,000 in 5 years, represented one of the war's most dramatic industrial mobilizations. The Higgins boat itself was deceptively modest. Measuring just over 36 ft long and under 11 ft wide, it was small compared to other naval vessels. Powered by a 2.25 horsepower Gray Marine 671 diesel engine, it could reach 12 knots, though rough seas often reduced speed. The plywood sides and rear minimized weight and conserved strategic steel, offering limited protection but allowing rapid, inexpensive construction. The steel bow ramp provided some shielding during the final approach to shore, while the shallow draft, 3 ft at the rear, 2 ft2 in at the front, allowed direct beach landings. A semi-tunnel protected the propeller, enabling beaching and reversing without fouling. Each craft was operated by 4 crew members, a coxswain controlling the ramp and steering, an engineer managing the engine, and 2 crewmen handling lines and operating 2 .30-caliber machine guns mounted at the front. The boat could carry 36 fully equipped infantrymen, a jeep, and 12 men, or up to 8,000 enlobes of cargo. The brilliance of the Higgins boat lay in its integrated design. The shallow draft enabled access to any beach. The protected propeller allowed repeated beachings. The bow ramp facilitated rapid troop deployment under fire. The powerful engine and planing hull allowed the boat to reverse off the shore efficiently. From approach to landing to extraction, the entire cycle could be completed in just 3 to 4 minutes. This rapid turnaround allowed each Higgins boat to make multiple trips per hour, ferrying troops ashore with astonishing speed. The first combat deployment occurred in August 1942 during the Guadalcanal landings in the Solomon Islands, America's initial large-scale amphibious operation of the war. The outcome would set the precedent for future campaigns. The 1st Marine Division employed various Higgins landing craft to storm the beaches. Under fire, the boats exceeded expectations, running up onto coral shores, lowering their ramps, and unloading Marines who surged directly into the jungle. The boats then reversed off the beaches without trouble, returned to the transports, and prepared for the next load. Within days, thousands of Marines and tons of equipment were ashore, a testament to the Higgins boats performing exactly as intended. Marine commanders immediately requested more for upcoming operations. 3 months later, in November 1942, Higgins boats played a critical role in Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. American forces landed at Casablanca in Morocco and Oran and Algiers in Algeria. Conventional craft would have struggled with the beaches and surf, but the shallow-draft Higgins boats landed directly on the sand. Troops could exit down the ramps into ankle-deep water or dry ground, rather than wading through chest-high surf. The boats then reversed and returned for additional loads. Within 3 days, over 100,000 Allied soldiers and vast quantities of equipment were ashore. Dwight Eisenhower, commanding the operation, sent Higgins a Thanksgiving Day telegram in 1942, praising the work of Higgins Industries for providing landing craft essential to the campaign. Higgins framed the message and displayed it prominently in his office as a symbol of recognition. The success in North Africa fully validated the Higgins boat design, triggering massive military orders. By 1943, Higgins Industries was producing boats at a pace that amazed outsiders. At peak output, the 7 plants generated more than 700 boats per month. Workers pushed themselves to exhaustion in 3 shifts operating 24/7. Plywood panels were precisely cut, fitted, and installed. Engines were mounted and tested. Steel ramps were fabricated and equipped with mechanical lowering systems. Completed boats were immediately loaded onto railcars for shipment across the U.S. and overseas. By the end of 1943, Higgins Industries had produced over 12,000 boats, most being LCVPs and their variants, which were distributed to every theater of war. In the Pacific, they accompanied Marines island hopping to Tarawa, Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, and dozens of other heavily contested locations. In Europe, they stockpiled in Britain for the invasion whose timing remained secret until D-Day. Planning for Operation Overlord began in earnest in 1943, with Eisenhower overseeing preparations. He knew that landing vast numbers of troops and vehicles on the beaches of Normandy, open stretches of sand backed by cliffs and fortified German defenses, would require thousands of reliable landing craft. The Higgins boat was the only vessel capable of handling such conditions at scale. Allied planners projected a need for over 5,000 landing craft for D-Day. Higgins Industries, along with licensed manufacturers producing boats to his designs, supplied the bulk of them. By war's end, production totaled 23,358 LCVPs. Workers at Higgins plants understood the stakes. Higgins addressed them directly over the loudspeaker. Each boat would carry American soldiers onto beaches defended by machine guns, and every craft had to be flawless. They rose to the challenge. By early 1944, southern England's staging areas were filled with inspected and tested Higgins boats, each assigned to units whose crews trained intensively. Troops practiced climbing cargo nets, beach landings, and rapid deployment under simulated fire, carrying full combat loads. On June 5, 1944, despite a 1-day weather delay, thousands of boats began loading troops from transports off the English coast. Men descended cargo nets into pitching craft, often seasick or drenched from waves, enduring a treacherous channel crossing. At dawn on June 6, 1944, over 5,000 Allied vessels waded off Normandy, surrounded by waves of Higgins boats loaded with troops. At Utah Beach, the first wave arrived at 6:30 a.m. The ramps dropped and soldiers surged into shallow water, facing lighter resistance than expected. The boats reversed successfully, returning for reinforcements, and 21,000 troops landed with only 197 casualties. At Omaha Beach, the situation was far grimmer. The 352nd Infantry Division occupied fortified cliffs with interlocking fields of fire. Limited naval bombardment failed to neutralize defenses. Higgins boats ran onto the shore under relentless fire. Troops exited down ramps into a deadly storm of machine guns. Casualties were severe. Some units lost over 90% in minutes. Bodies clogged ramps, forcing coxswains to manually lift them. Surviving boats made repeated runs, bringing reinforcements, ammunition, and evacuating the wounded. By day's end, roughly 2,400 Americans were killed or injured at Omaha, yet the Higgins boats continued to operate, enabling a foothold despite immense losses. Across all 5 Normandy beaches, approximately 156,000 Allied troops were landed on D-Day, including 73,000 Americans and 83,115 British and Canadians. In the following weeks, over 850,000 troops, 150,000 vehicles, and 570,000 tons of supplies were transported without capturing a single port, thanks largely to the Higgins boats. Eisenhower later reflected in 1964, decades after the war, "He's the man who won the war for us. Without Andy Higgins, we could never have gone in over an open beach. The entire strategy of the war would have been different." His assessment underscored the pivotal role of Higgins' boats in enabling Allied victory. The Allied forces would have been compelled to try seizing heavily fortified ports before landing substantial troops. Such missions would have been far more costly and might have failed completely. In the Pacific theater, Higgins' boats were equally vital to American strategy. The island-hopping campaign advancing across the Pacific toward Japan required amphibious assaults on numerous islands, each defended by Japanese forces ordered to fight to the death. At Tarawa in November 1943, Marines experienced the harsh reality of opposed amphibious landings against resolute defenders. The initial waves arrived in Higgins' landing craft and endured severe casualties crossing the reef and beach under intense fire. Yet the boats continued to arrive, wave after wave, until Marines amassed in sufficient numbers to overwhelm the Japanese through sheer force and firepower. The battle claimed over 1,000 American lives and wounded 2,000, but it established the operational model for future assaults. At Saipan, Guam, Plywood, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the same pattern recurred. Higgins' boats approached the shore in successive waves, disembarked troops under fire, reversed, and returned for reinforcements. Japanese defenders inflicted terrible losses from fortified positions, yet the boats kept delivering men until U.S. forces prevailed. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, where 6,800 Americans died capturing an 8-square-mile island, Higgins' boats landed 30,000 Marines in the initial waves at Okinawa in April 1945. During the final major amphibious operation of the war, Higgins' boats put 60,000 troops ashore on the first day. The boats even assisted in crossing the Rhine River into Germany in March 1945, ferrying soldiers under enemy fire from the eastern bank, proving their adaptability beyond typical beach assaults. By August 1945, when the war concluded, Higgins Industries and manufacturers producing boats under license from Higgins Patents had built 23,358 LCVP landing craft. Higgins Industries alone had produced 20,094 boats during the war, including 12,500 LCVPs, 199 PT boats, various LCMs and LCTs, and other specialized craft. These boats had landed more Allied troops on hostile shores than all other methods combined. They were used in every major amphibious operation across both European and Pacific theaters. Millions of American servicemen had ridden in Higgins boats at some point. The vessels became so familiar that soldiers no longer referred to LCVPs, they spoke of going ashore in Higgins boats. The name became synonymous with amphibious landings. Andrew Higgins himself became a nationally recognized figure during the war. Life magazine featured him in August 1943, detailing his plants, management style, and both his ingenuity and abrasive personality. President Franklin Roosevelt visited the Higgins plant on September 29, 1942, during a secret national tour of war production facilities. The visit was so classified that newspapers didn't report it until October 2nd. Roosevelt toured the PT boat facility in a convertible with Higgins, Louisiana Governor Sam Houston Jones, and Rear Admiral Frank T. Layton, 8th Naval District Commandant. Higgins explained the company's role in the war effort using ship models while seated with the president. Photographs of the visit were later published nationwide, making Higgins recognizable to millions. He received numerous awards and commendations from the Army, Navy, and Marine Corps, including multiple Army-Navy E awards, the highest recognition a civilian company could receive for war production. His plants displayed the flags, and workers proudly wore E pins, understanding they represented collective achievement. Higgins held around 30 patents related to landing craft and amphibious vehicles. His hull innovations, notably the protected propeller tunnel and spoon-shaped bow, were covered by U.S. Patent 2144-UN111, filed December 24, 1937, issued January 17, 1939. The bow ramp design was protected under U.S. Patent 2341866, filed December 8, 1941, issued February 15, 1944. These patents reflected years of practical experience building boats for Louisiana bayous, adapted for military use through collaboration with Marine officers like Victor Cruack, who recognized the value of Japanese innovations. Higgins' combative personality persisted throughout the war. He constantly clashed with the Navy's Bureau of Ships, who never forgave him for repeatedly proving that a civilian with practical knowledge could outperform their engineers. He opposed unions, believing they interfered with direct worker relations and production efficiency. He contested competitors he felt were unfairly favored in contracts. His language remained profane, his leadership confrontational, and his confidence in his abilities absolute. Workers either loved or feared him, but nearly all respected him. He paid well, promoted based on merit regardless of race or gender, and demanded excellence from everyone, including himself. As the war ended, military contracts were canceled. Germany's surrender in May 1945 and Japan's in August led to the rapid termination of contracts. Higgins Industries, built for maximum wartime production, suddenly had no orders. He attempted to pivot to civilian craft, prefabricated housing, and helicopters, but these ventures failed to replace wartime revenue. Union disputes grew as workers demanded better wages and conditions in peacetime, conflicts Higgins struggled to navigate. By November 9, 1945, Higgins liquidated Higgins Industries. In January 1946, he formed Higgins Incorporated to build pleasure craft and limited commercial boats. But by 1948, only one plant remained operational. Mounting debts strained the company. Higgins died on August 1, 1952, at 65, after a short hospitalization for stomach ulcers and a fatal stroke. His sons tried to sustain the business, but debts were insurmountable. By 1959, the company was sold. One factory became part of NASA's Michoud Assembly Facility in 1961, producing Saturn V rocket stages and shuttle external tanks. The legacy of Higgins and his boats endured long after the company's demise. The Higgins boat enabled a form of warfare the Axis could not counter. In Europe, Germans fortified ports along the Atlantic Wall, yet the Allies simply landed on beaches between them, where defenses were weakest. In the Pacific, Americans bypassed harbors, landing on coral beaches to establish beachheads faster than counterattacks could respond. The impact was profound, enabling the Pacific Island hopping campaign, invasions of North Africa and Italy, Normandy, and the advance into Germany. Every major Allied amphibious operation relied on Higgins boats. The design's brilliance lay in its simplicity, a spoon-shaped bow that rode over obstacles, a protected propeller for beaching and reversing without fouling, a planning hull for speed and maneuverability, and a steel ramp for rapid troop deployment. Each element solved a problem. Together, they created a vessel capable of repeated assaults under fire in any conditions. The boats proved effective on coral atolls in the Pacific, sandy beaches in North Africa, and pebble-strewn Normandy shores. Higgins' deep understanding of boat mechanics, developed over years of practical work in the Louisiana bayous, allowed him to deliver an already perfected solution adapted for war. Total LCVP production reached 23,358, with Higgins Industries producing 20,094, including 12,500 LCVPs, Allied forces landed on D-Day, totaling 156,000 soldiers, including 34,000 Americans at Omaha Beach. Remarkably, all of this was achieved without seizing a single port, relying instead on beaches that military strategists had considered unsuitable for major assaults. The effect on the war was enormous. Lives were spared because troops could rush down ramps rather than scaling the sides of craft under enemy fire. Operations succeeded that would likely have failed using conventional landing vessels. Victories came more quickly because Higgins boats could deliver troops ashore faster than opposing forces could mount a response. In 2000, a 7-block stretch of Howard Avenue in New Orleans, near the National World War II Museum, was renamed Andrew Higgins Drive. A year later, a memorial honoring Higgins was unveiled in his hometown of Columbus, Nebraska. In May 2019, he was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans highlights Higgins boats prominently, the location chosen specifically because the city had been home to Higgins Industries. Restored Higgins boats are displayed in museums across the nation, now iconic symbols of American industrial ingenuity and wartime problem-solving at scale. Higgins Industries' legacy of an integrated workforce, where black and white workers labored side by side for equal pay, demonstrated that racial segregation was not necessary for efficiency, a lesson that would resonate during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The story of the Higgins boat highlights the value of hands-on experience over purely theoretical knowledge. The Navy's Bureau of Ships, staffed with formally trained engineers, had failed for 20 years to produce an effective landing craft. Higgins, learning through trial and error, solved the challenge in just months. His practical expertise allowed him to design boats capable of meeting the military's toughest demands, showing that civilians with specialized knowledge could outperform bureaucracies. This insight reshaped military procurement for decades to come. Today, a restored Higgins boat stands outside the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Visitors can examine the plywood hull, the protected propeller tunnel, and the steel bow ramp. The craft seems small and unassuming, yet it crossed the English Channel in turbulent seas, delivering soldiers to Normandy beaches under fire day after day until victory was secured. Andrew Higgins passed away on August 1, 1952. At the age of 65, his company had ceased operations, and his personal fortune was largely gone. He is buried at Metairie Cemetery in New Orleans, but his boats carried millions of Americans into combat and helped secure Allied victory. Dwight Eisenhower's reflection in 1964 remains definitive. He's the man who won the war for us. If Andy Higgins hadn't designed and built these landing craft, we never could have gone in over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different.